Well, welcome to Claris FileMaker Under the Hood, though this may be more like in the oil pan, I think. I'll be going a little bit lower this time. I'm Clay Mackel. I started at Apple in '86. I started at Claris, the first version, in '87. Started working on FileMaker around '94, I think, doing the Windows port. So I was porting QuickDraw, so we could use the QuickDraw APIs to draw on top of Windows 2. Then that version got canceled because the exec staff at Apple decided that we weren't going to be doing Windows software originally. And then about 6 months later, we got a new president of Apple, and then they said, yes, we do want to do Windows software. So I started back on, luckily this time, Windows 3, which was a lot better to work on than Windows 2. Luckily, I never had to do Windows 1. That was, ooh. Now, let me mention, I've been ill for the last 2 weeks, so I haven't had much time laid out with a viral bronchitis, and so I really haven't practiced this that much, so we're going to see what happens. So what's going to be covered? We have the Draco data object. This is a very low-level object that's inside FileMaker, and everything pretty much goes through it. And I don't think I've ever had a talk through all these years to talk about that part. I've talked about indexing, finding, how data goes across the network and stuff like that, but I've never actually talked the lowest level of how data is brought in and out. And the main reason I'm talking about this is because we made some changes to it for JSON performance. So we'll get to see what it does and how it was extended to help JSON. Now I'll be talking about patching with the Claris FileMaker Upgrade Tool. We're actually getting very close to getting it all completed so you can actually patch files now with it. You could do some additions and deletions would work sometimes, but there's a bunch of random holes, so now at least it'll be useful. It may not be what you really want, but you'll actually be able to do work with it, and other people will probably write wrappers around it to make it useful at this point. And I'll go into some other changes of how the XML may change in the future, because this new artificial intelligence world is making other changes occur. And then I'll be talking about some other low-level changes occurring, mainly with the open source libraries and OData, which I'm going to be doing a sales pitch on that. So, so first, the Draco data object in JSON. So first, I don't know how many of you guys know what Draco is. Since Dominique's not here, you don't get to see that big airplane rotary engine anymore saying the Draco engine. That slide's, I guess, is gone for good now. But it's an engine that we started around '97. Originally, so FileMaker had this tree structure in a very flexible system. Then we got scared because Microsoft was coming out with Access, so we needed a relational engine. So we had this group creating this. Previous to this, it was called the Spectre engine, and it was more a SQL-style engine. But to do all the things the way that FileMaker actually worked and stuff like that, Christopher Krim had to write this layer to go between what FileMaker wanted and did and what this basically SQL engine did. And that middle layer just kept getting so much bigger, saying, well, why do we even bother using SQL? So we ended up coming with our own, because we wanted to push this other relational design down. So that's why you have our join graph style relationships and all the quirks of FileMaker, and not a SQL engine. It's all written in C++. It's broken in 3 different layers. These are in some of the previous slides. There's a support layer, which is kind of the operating system abstraction layer. So we can just use the same calls for doing file I/O, and it doesn't matter which. DB engine is pretty much what you would think is the database engine. It does all the calculations, queries, finds, and stuff like that. FM engine is where you get up into the user model, which is where you have scripting and all the context space. So down in the DB engine, there's really no context, but FM engine is where this whole thing, depending on what windows are foreground, when the script runs, and all that stuff. And the other thing with the Draco engine, it's the same engine is running on the clients and the server. It's the same exact code doing there. So the different engines decide what work needs to be done on the client, what work needs to be done on the server. And this has actually been changing over time in the different versions when we started doing sorting on the server side. So the client kind of decides, is it worthwhile to send the job over to the server to do the sort, or should I still continue to do it locally? Then more recently, was it 2 years ago or somewhere, we started doing summaries on the server side too. So there's a lot of work between these. So the Draco engine is actually pretty much everywhere. So WebDirect is using it. The iOS is using it. All these different locations are all using it. So what is DB data? DB data is the core object that whenever the contents of a field or the answer from a calculation engine or a parameter to a script is stored. It's the base object that handles that. It's C++. And variables. That's the other big thing. That object is when you put something into a dollar variable or dollar variable. It's stored in this DB data object that's actually hanging off the main file object representing that file. Or that's for the dollar. For the dollar, this object is actually hanging off the stack that's being used by the script engine and FM engine. So for each script that is running, it has a series of DB datas that are stored for each of the dollar variables that you have in it. And then when you go even lower down into the calc engine, if you're doing the let statement in there, those variables are actually DB data objects also. So if you say A equals, field 3 or something like that, that's actually a DB data that's being allocated and being stored with that name. It knows all the different types: text, number, date, time, timestamp, and container. Everything but containers in FileMaker is stored as text on disk in Draco. So whether it's a number, date, time, timestamp, text, it's all stored as text internally. We don't have a binary representation of numbers or of date times that we store there. This is one of the reasons why inside the database manager you can switch between date and time and number and text and all those changes, and it basically doesn't have to do anything because the text remains the same. It's just how we treat it. And it really affects how the DB data object works on that object depending on the type, how it treats the text when it's doing calculations on it. Well, if it's quick.
Is it UUID number? Wasn't the whole point of that is that it was stored as a numeric value instead of text and therefore faster?
No, it's still actually stored as text. A UUID number is faster because indexing and doing calculations on numbers is faster than doing it on text. It is still actually stored, even when you're using a UUID number, it's actually stored as text in the database. Now, when it's brought into memory and is being manipulated, then it's turned into this different binary form than a text form, and the comparison operators are different, and we'll get a little bit more into some of that stuff. So that's what I'm talking about here, is these native binary representations. So the DB data will always, well, it doesn't always have it, but when you load it in off disk, it's brought into either as a stream from the FileMaker file or as a binary text that's stored. But then there's this object called fixed point is how we store numbers. It's not a floating point number. It's not any of the standard numbers. It's our 400 significant digit number engine that does that. Date times, there's this one date time object that can handle dates, times, and timestamps. It's very simple. It's like, well, there's a date number and a time number and a year number. It's really pretty simple. There's a special binary object, and talk about, and now there's a new one I'll get to. This object is the thing that handles all the conversions as you go through the calc engine, or you take something from a text field and put it into a number field. It does any data type changes. If it needs to convert a timestamp into a number, it says, oh, I want to turn this DB data object into a number now. And if it finds that it has a timestamp in it, it says, okay, give me the number of seconds since, I forgot what year, 70 or whatever. Yeah, I think it is 0. So it handles all the conversion. It handles the locale changes. So if you have a date that's in a French database and you bring it over to the US database and it needs to render it and talk about it, it'll do the swapping of the month to year orders, and also font usage. In FileMaker, all the fonts are stored in these streams along with the text as numbers. So it'll be like 14. And then there's this big table that says font 14 is like Monaco. So if you have a DB data from one file, Monaco may be number 36 in this other file. So as you convert text from one file to another file, move one file to the other, you'll actually have to move over, change all the 14s to 36. Or if the other file actually doesn't have Monaco, it will add Monaco to that file, get the new number for that Monaco font, and then change the number to that so it can operate in the other file. So it's doing a lot of different conversions going between files, locales, and data types. And yeah, there's the font information table, and then the locale that's baked into each file. So whenever you create a file, it gets the locale of the system that your file was on. The only way to really change that is you create a clone, and then when you open the clone the first time, then it picks up what the locale is when you open the clone the first time and turns into a non-clone file. If you want to see what the class actually looks like in C++, you could actually download the plugin SDK. And it has the C++ header files in there. So all the plugin developers in here know about this already. But you can see here's the new for the different data types. You know, it has things like isEmpty. You can kind of guess that the isEmpty calc function calls this function on the DB data to determine whether it's empty or not. And there's all these other things to grab data as a fixed point or as a date time. Now we use the one datetime object, but FileMaker has a very different distinction of how it handles things that are dates, times. Dates returns like days from the year 0, I think, and the times are numbers from midnight. And then timestamps. You see there's a Boolean. We don't export Boolean as a data type inside FileMaker, but it is internally inside the calc engine. As the DB data is going through different transformations, you do like less than, greater than things. It's turned into a binary object. I mean, a Boolean object. And then there's this binary data object. Containers is just like a whole other talk, so I'm going to ignore containers at this point. You can find out what the locale it's currently using, whether its native type is, and then all the set. So you could actually plug in a fixed point number, but in some reasons you may not want to store it as a number type. You may want to store it as a text type and tell it that the native type is text. I have this fixed point, but I want it to be treated as text in any other parts of the calcs. So we're going to jump over to JSON parsing. So when the JSON functions were first put into FileMaker, so this blue object is the DB data. The native type is set to text. Text has been loaded into memory. This shared text object, so a DB data is always an individual object and it's not really shared between other things. But the text that's stored inside of it is like a shared text object. So so if you have one DB data and you assign it to this other DB data, say make this DB data equal to that, it's actually just the two of them are still pointing to the same actual low-level text object, but it has the ref count is bumped by 1. So making a copy of a DB data is actually pretty quick because there doesn't have to be much work. You just have to bump a number. Though all these text objects and those different methods that I showed you earlier, the minute you ask for text as a non-const object, right, as a modifiable object, then it splits that up. That's when the copy is actually done at that point. Then the DB data is the DB data that's being worked on that requires to make a change to the text. Will then make an actual copy of the text, store it as a separate object, and it'll be stored there. So once you have the text in here, previously it was just like if you did a JSON get element, you know, it would parse it into a binary representation of JSON, extract the index node here, then you would have that a new binary representation, it would convert it back to text and put it in there. So the first version, when the first versions of the JSON functions came out, things were pretty slow and we got a lot of complaints. So version 2, we added a cache that's hanging off each thread. So each thread that's running inside FileMaker had the same work here. You loaded the text and all that stuff. You would calc a CRC. You would scan this text, generate a CRC from it, and see if it matched the CRC that was stored off the thread. If it matched, then when we first loaded this thread storage up, we stored the binary representation. So we would just reuse it over and over again. So that means we wouldn't have to parse it, turn it into this large memory object that represented the entire nodes and all the nodes of the JSON. If it didn't match, then it would do the parse of the text and store it up and update the thread storage to match what we just read. Then you do like in version 1, you would extract the node from the JSON into another separate JSON object, usually probably a lot smaller because you're like pulling out individual members and stuff like that. and then it would be converted back to text and dumped into the DB data. So that's what was done then. But we're going to go down and look at more of what DB data. So if we start with the empty DB data, the type is invalid. There's a shared text object in there, which has no text in it. And you have a fixed point object, a datetime object that's just date, a datetime object that's used for time, one for datetime or timestamps, and the binary object that knows how to handle containers. So the first thing you do, so up here we're executing this calc up here. So the first thing is that, oh, we're referencing a field, so it's a text field. We grab the text off the disk, load it into the shared text object, and then in the DB data it's marked as this is valid now. The text is valid. And that's the first step. The second step is we hit the plus operator and saying, oh, we're adding a number to a text, and then there's all these big charts saying, well, what do you do at that point? At this point, we're saying, oh, well, the answer is going to be a number, is what the default operation for FileMaker is. So we know we need a fixed point representation of the text field. So at that point that we see that operator is coming up, the text is parsed, basically, and put into the fixed point object. It's basically put into an array of 32-bit integers. And the array is actually variable size, depending on how many significant digits you have. There's an integer portion and a fractional portion of it. It's actually a pretty complex object on itself. But it's brought in there. So you add the 1. So over on this fixed point object, it has a series of methods on it saying that, oh, I want to do an addition. I want to add this fixed point to this fixed point, or I want to subtract or do a trig function of some sort. So it does all the math and that stuff is done in the fixed point object. So now we have a fixed point number that has 1 added to it, and it's dumped back into the original DB data. So the calc engine works basically with this 1 DB data that's the first parameter, and then it's continued and manipulated, and it ends up being the response, or the answer to the calc engine. So the calc function has like 3 parameters. There's the main DB data, and then there's 2 other DB datas for the other 2 parameters. But all the work is usually done on the first one, since that's going to be the result of the calc. Now, in this calc, we were assigning it to a variable here. Oh, actually, I need to go back for one thing. OK, so here when we did the fixed point, and when we added the 1 to it, we did all the math work in here, so this fixed point object changed. But you notice that the checkbox is now gone from the text object, because this text that's stored here no longer represents the fixed point object. When we modified the fixed point, this was marked as, oh, this is not valid anymore. So then when we assign it into the variable, then a copy of this DB data is put and stored as a variable. Note that the text is still not valid, but it has a valid fixed point hanging on it. Now if you then feed this into like get as text with a $variable, it gets the DB data. It has a fixed point, but it doesn't have valid text. So at that point, the fixed point object will go through and say, OK, I need to generate text based on this locale. I use commas for decimal separators, or I use periods for comma, or what are all the different rules for the specific locale for the number. Generates the text and stores it in the text object. So none of this stuff is new. This all came from FileMaker Pro 7, and it's how the calc engine has been working for the longest time. So what have we done for JSON parsing version 3? So now we're going to do another calc. We start the same way. We have an empty DB data. So at the calc at the top here, we're going to load in a text field, get the index value as from the object inside there, and then store it in a variable. So as I mentioned, all text in FileMaker is stored as text on disk. So we load in the text. We see we're doing a JSON get element. And what's been added to DB data in this upcoming version of FileMaker Pro is now a native representation of JSON in here. So in addition to these types that we've had before, we've added a new type down in here. So basically everything is it basically all works the same way as I went through the number situation. There's now, and one other thing is, it's not just the raw JSON binary representation. It's a shared JSON binary representation, which is very much like the shared text. So if we need to use that elsewhere, and we're copying it, so as we're doing copy operations, we don't have to make another copy of the same JSON. It's just using that shared copy. The ref count gets bumped by num1. But if you then manipulate it, like you delete a node or add a node to it, then it has to split it at that point. So it has the same behavior like the text object in that case. So we've loaded in the text. So we had the parse text over here. We extract the index node into just a free-floating JSON binary representation, and then we put it back in as a shared JSON object in here. But since this object changed and it's current, then the text in this DB data object has to be cleared and say the text is no longer valid.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
The way the JSON object is stored, is that internally indexed so you can get to a particular element without reading the whole thing?
We're using a JSON library, an open source library, and it does all this work behind us. So it depends which JSON library you're talking about, how it does the indexing and stuff like that. The current library we're using right now is basically using C++ style containers. So it's actually stored into a map, and it's a sorted map. So which is I think it uses a B-tree structure internally in there. It depends on the standard C++ implementation for doing maps. And that's why it always gets sorted specially. That's why you see when the JSON comes out as text, is because it's in that sorted order, because that's how the standard C++ maps work. Technically, it doesn't have to store it that way, but that's what typically happens. So then we stuff it into the $variable. And just like before, like this fixed point version, there's no text hanging off the DB data object, but just the binary representation of the JSON. So if you then go through and you want to pull yet another sub-element out of what it was in the $variable, it just copies the $variable into another DB data object. Since it's a shared JSON object, it doesn't actually have to allocate any memory or anything like that for it. It just bumps the ref count pointing to that one. You extract out actually I should have said age, not index down there, and then replaces this, updates that. There was no text to clear because the text wasn't valid at all. So at this point, if you're going through and just doing JSON objects all the time, there's no text being generated at all. All the work is being done on this shared JSON object if all you're doing is like JSON type operations on it, like adding more objects. If you go through a loop, adding objects or fetching a bunch of separate ones. Now, that's what we did first, and I ripped out the thread cacher completely, saying that, well, we have the JSON there all the time, but it turned out there's a lot of products out there that kept loading in the text from using a global field or a text field and stuff like that. So things would really slow down because the cacher was gone. So we basically had to add in a version 2 style JSON processing cache back in as a thread cache. But this time, something else we noticed is that I was talking about how we were generating that CRC all the time to compare to see if the cache was valid. As the JSON objects people were using was getting larger and larger, it was actually taking a long time to generate that CRC if you had a 2 megabyte object. I mean, you still have to rip across it all, but you still have to read all the data. Though we didn't have to nearly store as much memory and stuff like that, so it was more efficient that way, but as memory is more readily available nowadays, what we now do with the thread storage is we just store a DB data there itself. So an actual DB data that has, it may or may not have the text, it has the JSON associated with it. Well, no, actually it has to have the text. I take that back, it actually has to have the text. Because what it does is that if we have a DB data that does not have any shared JSON in it, and we know we're going to need the binary representation of the JSON, it's going to compare this text with the text that's stored with the thread. Now, as long as the first few bytes are different on the JSON, I mean, unless your preamble to your JSON is exactly the same all the time. But if it's, if there's a difference within the first 50 bytes, it's going to only have to scan the first 50 bytes to see that, oh, it's different. I mean, you will have to scan the entire thing if you have a hit, but if you have a hit, then you're not making any copies and you don't have to do the parsing. But if you have a miss, then you know. So in this case, we did compare the text. It was fine. It was equal. So all we do is we copy the parsed JSON and stick it in there. And if it isn't different, then we actually do the parse in the original object and then store that as a copy off the thread storage. Which, since I'm talking about, this is shared text here, this is shared JSON here. So making a copy and storing it in the thread storage is really not doing much more memory allocations. It's just bumping up the ref counts to it. So as long as you never change that JSON directly that's in these DB datas, then there's not much work having to be done. So doing all this, what I'm calling these passive improvement formats is, so without changing anything in your solutions, so there's these different benchmark files. 2ForU has one, Christian has one back there. Some other people have posted these different files. This lower one was one that we did a long time ago to check our original caching. But you can see from the pre-2025 version, these 4 operations are like from 2 to almost 10 times faster. This one, this operation, which was this regression test that he had, the main reason he wrote this was just to show how slow it was when we didn't have when I ripped the cacher out completely. But since I put it back in, it's like 7 times faster. This JSON loop test speed, we're getting ranges from 16 to 4 times faster. This 1.1 version, in this test file, so he had parse, he was trying different techniques to speed up the JSON parsing going on. So he was using just get JSON element. He had this interesting technique to use delete element to improve the speed. He would use it as I think it was as a list of as values instead, and would do like delete operations to pull the value out. But it's been interesting to see what you guys have been doing as different techniques to speed up the JSON. And then he had another one where he was using get value basically to do the JSON. He was basically treating it as a list completely. And this one really blew out when I didn't have the cacher in there, because he was having to the code was having to reparse it exactly all the time. And then Monkey Bread has a couple different versions of tests, which are like either 2.5 or 6.5 faster. In the FileMaker test that we have, what's going along here is the amount of JSON that's in the object is increasing as you go across the X version here. This is the old way of doing it, but you can see as the JSON got larger and larger, it was not a linear increase here. But the new version, in addition to being faster, like from 80 down to 25, it has a more linear path going on it, and then reads are almost flat down along the bottom. So we can handle JSON objects, larger JSON objects, faster than we did previously. But there are things that you can do to help improve performance. The big thing you want to do is try not to use trigger using the thread cache version. So there's 2 new functions that have been added. I'll show some examples of what you can do later. But there's this new JSON parse function, which when you look at it, you say, well, it does nothing because you don't really see anything different. It parses the input parameter, and it just returns the text that was in there. But it populates the native JSON object that's in there. And if it's an error, if it's not valid JSON, it actually caches the error of the JSON that's in there too. So if you feed this thing through and you feed it to a whole bunch of JSON functions, we're not parsing it over and over, getting an error all the time. Is once we've parsed it once and we've cached the error, we just return the error immediately. Okay, and saving this result in a variable not a field. Because if you put it back into a field, either a global field or a field that's in a table, remember we store everything as text inside FileMaker. So the JSON representation basically goes away and it's just pure text at that point again. So the key thing you really want to do is when you get your JSON, you want to throw it into a variable of some sort, either a global variable, a stack-based variable, or a calculation variable. And then reusing it will help a lot. And then on the ETS, someone really wanted to know what was the state of the variable at a point. So this thing will look at it, it will return 0 if it does not have a JSON representation for it. It will return a -1, meaning that the JSON that's in this object is invalid, and otherwise it will return the same number you get for a JSON get element type of whether it's a object, text, number, null, whatever. So, key things. You do not want to do this. You do not want to load in a variable from field 1 into a variable and then do work on it, then load in a field from field 2, do work on it, and then go back and read field 1 again and then field 2 again. Because you're going to be regenerating the cache on each of those 4 statements. This is going to be absolutely the slowest way to do anything. Just reordering it so that you deal with field 1 first, do all the works on it, and then second, then you're getting the help from the caching operations that I mentioned. The best way to do it is to load in your content from your fields and put them into a variable of some sort, either the global variable or a stack-based variable. Or if you're getting the JSON from, if you were doing like insert from URL, you were hopefully you were dumping it into a variable and not into a global field. Because a global field still, you want to put it into a variable that's a memory-based structure that's hanging around. So the best thing to do is get your JSON into this form, and then it'll only ever be parsed once, whether it's invalid or valid. And then it really doesn't matter what order you do these operations with afterwards, and doing, adding things to the JSON or removing things from the JSON. So that's the big key. This doesn't work even in the current product. This is the worst way to use the current product too, because of the same, we just cache one object on each thread. So now I'm going to move on to changes with the Claris FileMaker Upgrade Tool. So we've been making a lot of changes with the command line tools because the big thing we wanted to do is, as people have been using it more and doing more things with it, is that we're finding that a lot of people depend on plugins to do things properly. So if you use the migration tool and to change a calc, and the calc depends on a plugin function, since it didn't load any plugin functions, you would pretty much get question marks for all your stored calcs or anything like that if you were using plugin functions like that. So now, for the migration tool, developer tool, and the upgrade tool, there's now a parameter to pass in a folder to load plugins in for it. Now these plugins pretty much have the same restrictions as server-based plugins. So there's no UI, so if it's trying to use the window manager or trying to do other things. Some plugin vendors may actually have to tweak their plugins a little bit depending on how they detect whether they actually have a window manager. Hopefully they assume that they don't have a window manager and look for it. But some of them may actually try to do some operations in a new environment because it'll show up as, it won't show up as a server product, it'll show up as a tool product. So there may be some plugins may need some updates, but it should be very easy updates for them to do to fix it to work with the command line tools. Unfortunately, to load in plugins and stuff like that, we were trying to write the command line tools to be standalone executables, a single individual file that you could run. But plugins actually have to hook into dynamic libraries. So to talk to FileMaker, there's this library that we have that they all talk to access the FileMaker functionality, like I showed with the SDK header file that I showed earlier. those are all in a framework that the plugins link to be able to make calls to the DB data object. Which ends up making it a lot more of a complex object to run, and we run into security, signing issues with the Mac OS when we start having frameworks with command line tools. There's a whole bunch of other issues, so for this next set of command line tools coming out, you'll pretty much have to install Server, which does all the proper notarizing and telling the operating system that this was all signed by Claris and all these executables are valid. Later on, it may be its own release or something like that. We'll probably come out with a separate installer just for the command line tools if you want to run it on a different machine. But we didn't have time to go through and create full installers. So we have to create full Windows installers, Ubuntu installers, and Mac OS installers. And then have them all signed properly, get all the, the codes. To do all the signing stuff is always a bit of a hassle with, Ubuntu doesn't have a signing authority, so dealing with Windows, because we have to have like a separate machine that is validated by Microsoft to sign our code with, it's really a pretty big hassle, but now we can get more into just the upgrade tool. Yeah, I ran out of time and didn't create a bunch of fancy blocks for this, so I have to just describe this. So inside FileMaker, for pretty much anything that's not data is stored in these things that we call catalogs. So a catalog has like an array of nodes of each of the individual elements. So like if it's accounts, it's each account. If it's privilege sets, it's each privilege set. If it's each custom function, it's each custom function. If it's layouts, there's a separate node for each layout. Then there's a little node to the side of it that has metadata that represents things that for the entire catalog. If there's like specific options to the catalog, it has these little caches to speed up the finding of looking up a member by name and find out what the actual key value is. So it's a pretty complex object. And they all have the same base C++ class underneath it that handles all the networking and locking with other users. So if you're editing custom functions or you're editing layouts and stuff like that, all the locking APIs and all the catalogs know how to protect themselves from other people editing the same object at the same time. And there's two different major flavors of item catalogs. There's the item-based catalogs and unified-based catalogs. The item-based catalogs are like layouts and scripts where you can lock individual members. So you can have two different people editing the same script at the same time or the same layout at the same time. But then there's other catalogs, which I'm like the accounts catalog. You can't have people editing individual accounts on different machines. Once someone starts editing the account catalog, they lock the entire catalog. So then you have full access to everything. Because you kind of need that, like with the account catalog, the order is very important in how you move things around. And it makes some of these catalogs that are smaller a lot more complex. And each of these catalogs are very independent. They know that they're locking a certain thing, so they have their own locking codes and stuff like that. The table occurrence, the table, and relationship actually has kind of a meta object on top of it, so that when you start editing one, it opens all three and then locks them all right away, so that you can't have someone that's modifying TOs and the other one modifying a field or the number of tables and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of different work there. So here I'm going to be talking about mainly the rest of this talk is going to be about the account catalog. So this is a catalog that has the accounts in it. It has two members in it. And these are the default ones that get created when you create the account catalog. You have the guest account and the admin account. One's active and one isn't. Now we start getting into the XML. So when you do save as XML and look at the accounts catalog, so that's why you see catalog here and all the XML representations. It tells you that there's two members. There's this object list thing, which is I want to get rid of, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. But then you have account. the first account, which has an ID of 1, these are the internal IDs that FileMaker uses for everything. Since we look up everything by ID, we don't look things up by name. So that's how you can go through and change the names of fields and stuff like that, because we do everything by ID. So that's a very important number. Kind 0. This is something else when I was coming up with the demo I was seeing, is that the kind and the type are actually the two same things. It's a FileMaker type account, and 0 represents a FileMaker type account. But pretty much everything else uses just the type and ignores the kind, so I'm not sure why we bother spitting out the type. So, and then enabled is the flag saying whether it's enabled or not. We have these UUIDs. I don't like the name of that either, but it's really, well, you can have like a 3-hour discussion about UUIDs. But. And then here's the description. That account didn't have any description on it. This is the name of the account type. When you save the XML, you get this encrypted thing that you can't get the password from it, but you can tell if the password has been changed. If you look at it a second time, you'll have a different random set of bytes there. And then the other key thing is which privilege set that this account is associated with. So guest was associated with the read-only account. The full access, the admin account was linked to the full access account. And you notice that we have the ID here. And the name here is mainly just to help developers see the name. But internally inside FileMaker, we tend to use ID all the time. So if I want to add a new account to my file using the upgrade tool, I would write a little FileMaker file that looks just like this, or a little XML file with saying it's an upgrade tool patch, the version number, structure, and the keyword here is add action. This means that for this fragment, we want to add this to the FileMaker file. We have the account catalog, and I only have one member, so I'm only adding one account. I give it a type. I make up a UUID number that I like. I like 9s, so I use a lot of 9s in it. I set the description to this, give the account name here. I can actually give it a clear text password here at this point, since I'm pushing it into the FileMaker file. Hopefully you'll burn this file after you do it. And I want to associate it with the data entry account. So when I run the upgrade tool, I give it the name of the original file. I pass in the name of this file, and then I can pass in the name of the file that I want to generate from it. Or if you really want to update the file and make the change in the original file, you can do that too. But we try to like to be safe. Is that okay? Let's make a copy of the file with it in there. So now if I dump the same, so if I do save as XML this time, again on the new file, which I saved into a file called demo1, and I've folded the XML for 1 and 2 for the first 2 accounts in here. So they're the same. But now you'll see there's a account ID number 3 that's been created. It has my new account, CGA. You can't see the password anymore. You're seeing the encrypted version of it. Now what you'll notice here is that the source UUID is the UUID that I specified inside the XML when I said to add it. And this is how like the add-on products work too. There's the UUIDs in the add-ons, and when you insert it in there, they get new UUIDs in there. But we wanted to be able to track what things came from a particular add-on, so we can look at that number and find out where it came from and look it up. But the new real UUID, and you see, well, you get this information of who updated it, the account name, when it was added, and this is the actual UUID for the object now. So to do an update, so let's say I added this new account, and now I want to change the description, and now I want to have it point, instead of to the data entry privilege set, I want to point it to the, what did I say there? The read-only one. Now note, I can still use the UUID that I used originally for my add operation. So when we're trying to find the object to modify, when you're doing deletes and updates, we'll look for the UUID as the true UUID first, If we can't find that, then we'll say, oh, maybe this was something you added, and what was the UUID you used when you added the object, and then we'll check for that one and find it. And then there's like even further fallback. If we can't find that, then it'll try to find the name of the object, and that's still a little bit of flux of what the full fallback process is. I guess Todd was telling me he has a 7-step fallback process on his stuff. I could only think of 4, but I may have to talk to him and see what he's doing. But so here's the replace operation. I execute it, and now you'll see that I've changed that. It now points to read-only access. And then the last major thing is deleting. So deleting is pretty simple. You just need to pass in the reference of the thing you want to delete. So here I'm still using my original UUID that I used when I added the object, or I could use the new UUID when it was added to the file. But since I wanted to do the steps, I wanted to create the XML files and just be able to do them over and over again to add, update, and delete. Since I didn't know what the new UUID number was going to be, I can still use the original one. So if this object, this calc function or something like that, this may be your real UUID for that, for that object. If you're spewing it into a bunch of different files, managing UUIDs is going to be a completely different topic. But so we have the delete. Oh, and the previous one, it was like replace action. Now the keyword over here is delete action. Now you can put these all in the same file if you want. You could have the add, replace, and delete, and we'd go through it, would add, replace it, and then delete it, and you'd end up with the original file again. Well, the mod count would be different, saying that this catalog was modified 3 times, but you can do that. So you can have multiple deletes, or you may be deleting old stuff and putting in new stuff. It all depends what you want to do with it. So after I do the delete object, I'm still folding the first 2. So account number 3 is now gone.
Can we imagine using that for customers who have solutions which are heavily corrupted to recreate from the ground?
Yeah. There was in one of the special forums, I think it was the Quality of Life kitchen, there's a flag that can be turned on in a current version of FileMaker where you can just feed in an XML file and it'll just generate the entire FileMaker file from it. So you can do save as XML and then later just feed it back in and you get a FileMaker file out again. The upgrade tool isn't currently doing that, but it'll be in there soon. And there's a few things right now that aren't quite working properly. I think page setup, the storage of the page setup nodes. Most of the major nodes are all, when I tried it, it pops up and you get a usable thing, but there are, if you poke through everything inside the FileMaker file, you'll find there's a few things that aren't quite there yet that we're still working on and cleaning up. So for the future stuff we want to do, as I was mentioning earlier, there's things that I didn't really care for, like the catalog names. The catalog names show up in multiple places. Like you'll see it up like in the logs from server when you're looking at the top calls and stuff like that. And I've been finding out we've been using slightly different names all throughout the FileMaker products and stuff like that. So we really need to go through and kind of unify what we call all these things. And it doesn't help because like table occurrences is not in the code anywhere at all because we were calling that table aliases. And I don't know how many years Chris tried to convince all you guys to call it table aliases, but that never worked. Somehow table occurrence popped out and got stuck. There's some tagless tag stuff in there that really isn't being used. There's some places where you really actually need the object list node that's inside there when there's a list of things, like when you have the list of objects that are in an individual layout. But it was used many more places. I know this is a big request of people dealing with the XML, is that sometimes a lot of the bit flags, like for script steps or for field validation and stuff like that, will have a whole bunch of, it'll just be a number, and some people will decode that number and tell you which bit means what. But we really want to go through and turn those into individual names so you can actually see what the flags actually are. Some other naming differences. And something that's actually driving things a little bit more importantly, because we're getting pushback from other parts of the company, is that they're feeding, you know, as you heard earlier today, is that we're starting to train these LLMs to know about the FileMaker format. So they've been noticing some things that would really be nice to change to make it easier to train LLMs about FileMaker and to have it generate XML for you so you could run it into this stuff. So there's some tweaks we may be making for that. So I'm thinking that what we currently have is we're calling XML2, which we're going to probably keep this way. So we're trying to do minor patches so we don't break too many people, but there may be a XML3 coming up in the future as we decide how much we actually have to change for the LM work and to just do general cleanup and in general. And the other thing we've been requesting for is a document type definition for the XML. So, and it'll be easier if we start with a clean slate version 3. That I'm going to make sure that we write the document type definition first, and then implement to it. Instead of trying to figure out how to write it from what we currently have. And then also, we want to do more documentation on it.
Are these FileMaker 22 changes that you're...
The stuff before this future stuff is going to be out in the version they talked about today, which I really don't know when it's going to come out, because some people want it out earlier, some people want it later, so whenever that version comes out. This will probably be next year, I would say, this future section here. Because there's still a lot of work trying to deal with what we're doing with the LLMs and things that the LLMs are changing so fast. Maybe we don't have to do anything because they'll be so smart they'll be able to handle what we currently do. So, though I wouldn't bet on that. Okay. Yeah, I'm running slow. Well, this is pretty quick here. So I usually put this up whenever I give a talk of all the third-party libraries that we've updated. And some of the updates are due to security issues that were found in these open source libraries or fixing bugs. And it is best to try to keep this stuff always up to date. There's two things I do want to point out. The libantler, that's how we parse SQL statements. It's our main parser. Version 3 is pretty ancient. To actually run the compiler or to generate the code from the description, I think we have to run a version of Mac OS 10.8, I think, or something like that, because that's the last version that the tools run on. And unfortunately, libantler 4 was a massive change in their APIs. So we've had to rewrite a lot of stuff, and poor Jackie's been having to find all these edge conditions and stuff like that. So if you're on the ETS, really run your SQL statements through it and make sure that we've caught everything. But since it was so painful to use version 3, we wouldn't make many changes to the SQL statements and the changes for that. And this is another thing being driven by the AI requirements, is because a lot of AIs prefer to generate SQL statements for results and stuff like that. Though you'll probably see some demos of where we have LLMs generating FileMaker style find requests. You ask for I want to find this, this, and this, and it'll generate an actual FileMaker find request for you without going through the SQL route of trying to do that. So we can teach it that way, but there's people that really want to have upgrades to the SQL parser and having to add in some keywords that, of course, all these keywords are things that are not part of the original SQL standard, but are generally implemented by most of the SQL databases out there currently. And the other thing I wanted to point out is, while we don't have a new version of OpenSSL, we realized that we built the OpenSSL without all the optimization flags turned on. So you should be doing TLS type work and encryption and stuff like that faster. And the last big thing, we've been making a lot of OData changes. I don't think this has anything to do with AI. This has more to do with Claris Connect and Claris Studio. So When they were talking earlier today, showing you how they're fetching data in and out of FileMaker, they're using OData now. And OData is basically what the new API that we prefer you to use when talking to FileMaker. Much like the XML API is still around if you still want to use it. There's some people that have never updated to the FileMaker Data API, but we did kill PHP. We did actually remove something. The FileMaker Data API is going to kind of go the same way. It'll still be there. You can still use it. But I was getting some requests from people today asking for some changes to it to make some, make it work differently and stuff like that. I basically said no. If you want it, ask for it in the OData thing. Because the other thing is that we're going to get rid of the current ODBC handler. There's a separate process running on server and we have this custom protocol that's going from the JDBC driver and ODBC driver that talks to this process. It's using its own private protocol, which we've had to make upgrades to it and make it more secure and use the latest version of TLS, and it's just a whole bunch of hassles. So our plan is that we're going to come up with there'll still be a FileMaker ODBC driver and a FileMaker JDBC driver, and they'll basically look the same, except for it's going to be talking OData to the FileMaker server. So it's going to be going through a standard HTTP request, go through all the standard security stuff, through the web server and all that stuff. So will be a lot less work for us to keep it secure. Other things were, I guess I should have started at the top. OData 4.0 didn't require a bunch of aggregate support. But to do this work here, we need all the aggregate functions to work properly, like the SQL style. So we're implementing all the aggregates to match the same functionality that you get from a SQL statement, a SQL thing. We've added in better container support, so you can get the name of the container, and just generally managing containers. It'll be a lot easier. You'll actually start fetching, you'll be able to get value lists through OData. If you want a particular value list, you can actually get it from ODBC because there's a new system table to list all the value lists. And this is mainly for Studio and Connect, though. It may be useful for you too. Is webhook support. So as records change inside FileMaker, if you give us a hook to call, we'll call you and send you a JSON payload saying what changed or what record changed.
Is that separate from the on-window transaction?
Yeah, that's separate from the on-window transaction.
Also, when a record gets deleted?
Yeah, it'll be deleted.
Because now it's very impossible to track deletion of records. There's no script trigger or something, so that would be a way then to track deletion of records.
Yeah. Well, the on-window transaction does tell you when a delete occurs. And you're actually you're given access to the data inside the custom calc that you have in there to pull out whatever you want before the record gets deleted. So there is work you can do with that trigger, but that trigger doesn't work with the data API or OData or any of the regular APIs. That on-window transaction requires a window to have a script trigger to be called from it. So. This is basically giving that capabilities to an API to be able to get these type notifications. And there'll probably be like other notifications because the Connect team, as you saw, wants to know when the schema changes inside FileMaker. So it may want to pull some more fields over and pull some more data over. Ooh, I have a minute left. Okay, talked about JSON performance. Patching FileMaker files, open source library is a feature of OData. I'm supposed to remind you to go into your Engage to go thing and rate your sessions. Please rate all the sessions. Rosemary was complaining that she only had 22 reviews about 30 minutes ago. She wants more. If you want to see me, tomorrow I'm going to be at the booth from 8 a.m. Okay. So I'll be there from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Otherwise, you can probably find me up in the museum that's up on the 5th floor, in the Colorado room to see. Yeah, I think roughly 60% of the stuff in there is stuff that I had and stuff like that. We've gotten stuff from other people. And we have no time for questions, but we can probably hang out here for, we get a few questions in. Yeah.
Did we get any benefit from the PDF writer library update?
Oh, yeah, I should be repeating the questions because of the recording here. Are we going to get any updates from the PDF writer? There's some bug fixes in it and stuff like that. But what you saw today of pulling the text out of it, I think that's actually using a new open source library to read that stuff out. You'd have to ask the LLM people and stuff like that how we're pulling it out. Because they were going through a bunch of different libraries trying to suck the text out. And even we were trying to use some of the Apple stuff to do it, and it really wasn't doing that great of a job either. So I forgot which open source is doing the PDF text pulling. Here's way back there.
So just to clarify, so is the goal ultimately to get rid of the data API and go complete O on that side?
The OData API to go complete what?
OData. Is it to get rid of the current API and go to OData?
Yeah, our plan, well, so all the other, so Connect and Studio are going to be basically using the OData completely eventually. And I mean, we do have the script step to execute the FileMaker data API in the script engine. Once we get these other changes done that was listed on this future list, once they're all done, we'll probably then make a script step that does a similar thing so you can actually execute the OData. Now, you won't be able to do the webhook internally inside the scripting engine, but you'll be able to do session list queries that way. And it should be faster than the FileMaker Data API, because the FileMaker Data API, when you execute the script step, actually has to create a whole FileMaker session, do the work, and then tear the session down after that script step completes. So the OData, since it's, the nice thing about OData is it's a true stateless REST API. So it doesn't matter what you call before or after it.
Is the current OData on par with the data API as it ships today?
Yeah, it's asking whether the OData is currently up the same as the FileMaker Data API. Other than the container stuff, the container stuff works better in the FileMaker Data API currently. But if you're not dealing with containers, it actually does some stuff better and faster. I mean, you have more flexible filter querying, and you don't have to use a record. You don't have to use the record ID. You can actually use your primary key for all your API calls. So in many ways, it's a much nicer, more standard API than the FileMaker Data API, which is very FileMaker centric and very close to the old XML API. With the OData, we're trying to implement everything the way that OData wants things, so it's more standards based. Yes?
I think the only API that lets you manipulate the schema is the SQL API, right?
No, the OData has commands to add fields and delete fields.
Can I create tables with it as well?
Yeah, I believe you can add tables too. It has a, it basically has the same functionality as the ODBC stuff. And we may be extending it a little bit more now that we're adding in valueless support, because that's the next thing the Connect team wants. They're saying, oh, it's nice that we can read and get all the valueless. We want to update your valueless too now. So
The SQL API is not going to go away.
no, we're not getting rid of the SQL API. And then maybe we'll be adding some of that stuff to our flavor of SQL too, since I mentioned that OData is going to be the back end for our ODBC drivers. So everything is going to be, so that's the nice thing about concentrating everything into one process, is that any fix that we make there will probably be able to work with ODBC, JDBC, OData, and Connect and Studio and everything that's going through the OData API. I can probably handle one more question before they run us out.
So when you're talking about LLMs generating XML for FileMaker, we extend that out, that XML would be like what you were showing here to update and or copy paste in to create schema?
Yes, that's what it would be generating now. Whether you copy and paste it or whether it does it automatically, I mean, the UI of what all the AI stuff is going to look like in the future is out of my realm, and I'm just giving them the low level of functionality to be able to do that stuff. Whether you're going to have a chat window on the side and you negotiate with the AI of what you want, or I have too much other stuff to worry about that portion of it. So yeah, let's do just one more. But yeah.
I'm just going to ask about as we get more of these patch type operations, either sloppy developers, malicious developers, or insane LLMs, how much validation is happening as those changes are being merged into our solution?
So
if we only partially trust the data.
Yeah. Well, at the catalog level, how I was talking about how these catalog objects, they validate all their individual. So an individual item that's added in a specific location will be valid once it's put in there. Now, whether it's terribly useful for the script step that you wrote that's not referencing it, or there won't be that type of validation. But at the low level, for each member, the Draco layer, when it parses the XML, goes to the same API that the UI is going through to add those items into the catalog. So all the validation that was being done in the client is being actually done from the XML too. Now, I guess that's something else, is that the errors coming back from stuff like that isn't very useful right now. It's basically, oh, your patch failed. Oh, was it because I tried to, enter an invalid value for this validation or something like that. So there is more work that needs to be done on the upgrade tool to make it more friendly, I guess. But we're trying to really get all the base functionality up there so that the AI teams can use it and stuff like that. But I think I'm going to be pulled off the stage now. So yeah, thanks for coming.